In this episode, we join local historians on the hunt for the lost gravesite of one of the most notorious and feared figures in northern Illinois history, John Driscoll, of Prairie Banditti fame, purportedly the head of a vast criminal network. Has his lost resting place finally been discovered in a lonely farm field? And did he and his eldest son, William, deserve their fate? A brutal execution by firing squad, the torching of their homes and farms, and the judgment of generations.
We revisit one of our favorite stories of the northern Illinois frontier, Bandits and Vigilantes, set in a time when Euro-Americans tentatively colonized the north portion of the state of Illinois, then the Wild West, shortly after the forced removal of Native Americans by the mid-1830s. We would suggest that viewers watch at least a few of the earlier videos in the Bandits and Vigilantes series to get a fuller understanding of this story. But here we'll offer this brief synopsis. On the frontier plains of northern Illinois in the late 1830s and early 1840s, communities were vexed by pervasive crime, including horse theft, robbery, and burglary. The rumored roots of this crime wave was a syndicate led by the Driscoll and Brody families, living on farms in East Ogle County and West DeKalb County. At the same time, a new Ogle County courthouse was being built, an imminent symbol of law and order in the county, with its first pending cases against purported members of the Driscoll gang, only to see the new structure burned down on the eve of the trial in late March of 1841. Suspicions of arson immediately arose, with blame being cast towards the Driscolls and their notorious criminal network.
In frustration, a vigilante group was formed, dubbed as the Regulators, with membership across multiple northern Illinois counties. Growing to more than 100 members, an Ogle County farmer by the name of John Campbell ultimately came to lead the company. This local militia then began targeting and terrorizing the friends and acquaintances of the Driscolls, with interrogations, beatings, and whippings, while demanding that they remove themselves from the area. In response, the eldest Driscoll son, William, sent a letter to John Campbell, insisting that he and his regulators cease and desist, and challenging him to a direct confrontation if so desired. Within days, Campbell and a large group of regulators showed up on William Driscoll's farm in western DeKalb County, threatening him and his family, and demanding that the Driscolls retire from the state. William Driscoll brought in the DeKalb County sheriff, who calmed the situation, but left the conflict unresolved.
Within days of this encounter, John Campbell was shot and killed in front of his home in White Rock Township, Ogle County, reportedly by 2 or 3 men. The Driscolls were quickly implicated, especially sons Edward and Taylor Driscoll. Posses rode out in search of Edward and Taylor the day following the Campbell murder, but with no success. And although there was little evidence to tie John Driscoll and his sons William and Pierce to the crime, these 3 were instead rounded up by the growing vigilante mob.
As the mob grew in size and spectacle, the Driscoll prisoners were brought to a lonely grove 4 miles to the southeast of Oregon on June 29, 1841. Here a mock trial was held in front of several hundred onlookers, with a jury of regulators, more than 100 men, who declared the Driscoll father and eldest son, John and William, to be guilty as charged, while allowing the third Driscoll, Pierce, to go free. The 2 convicted Driscolls were then led in front of a firing squad of more than 100 men, the regulators, the same men who had passed judgment. With a signal and a burst, the assembled rows of gunmen simultaneously discharged their muskets and guns against the kneeling and blindfolded Driscolls, killing them emphatically and mercilessly.
Within 3 months, 112 vigilantes were indicted and tried for the Driscoll murders. But as many of the jurors in their trial were themselves regulators, they were all acquitted of the charges.
After publishing our Bandits and Vigilante series 4 years ago, describing these tragic and riveting events, we were contacted by a local Ogle County resident and historian, Thomas Lichty. Tom had been doing his own investigations of the Driscoll family for several years, which led him to purchase a portion of the original Driscoll farm, giving him a deep understanding of the Driscoll family and their affairs.
When the Lichtys purchased this property in 2015, they were pleasantly surprised to learn that the purchase came with a cache of documents, originating from the Ogle County Abstract Office, tracing the lineage of the property from John Driscoll's purchase in the late 1830s until the early 1920s. Within these documents were contained many of the details of the Driscoll family's distribution of the property following the death of John Driscoll, how the land was partitioned up and eventually sold off. These deed details, taken together with court records and other available sources, record the carving up and dissolution of the Driscoll's timbered hideaway set along the Killbuck Creek.
Recall that immediately following the lynching of John and William Driscoll in the late afternoon of June 29, 1841, that sources told of the destruction of John Driscoll's property by the Vigilantes. His log house and outbuildings were laid waste, burned to the ground. Some members of the Driscoll family were said to have lived in a corn crib for months following the destruction.
Indeed, subsequent records tend to support this version, as there is an 1844 court record indicating that Mary Mercy Driscoll was then living in DeKalb County and not on the John Driscoll property, which is suggestive of there being no house to live in. And subsequent land records make no mention of improvements to the Driscoll property, such as structures or buildings, which is also suggestive.
Mercy, or Mary Akins Driscoll, was 55 years old at the time of the lynching of her husband and son. She, along with Driscoll neighbor Levi S. Hobart, were appointed administrators of the John Driscoll estate, as it went through probate following his death. However, by the early summer of 1844, her role as estate administrator was revoked, as she refused to comply with court proceedings when it required that she submit additional bonds. Thereafter, the estate appears to have lingered in limbo. However, as the remaining heirs of John Driscoll, his several children, did not appear to take issue with their mother's lack of resolution of the estate, the court appears to have let sleeping dogs lie.
Records indicate that Mercy Driscoll passed away during the first half of 1848. This triggered a court case in which the local heirs of John Driscoll Jr., Delilah, Emmeline, and Sarah, filed suit in the Illinois Circuit Court against their siblings who were no longer in the area, Betsy, Pierce, David, Taylor, and the heirs of William Driscoll, in order to settle the final affairs of John Driscoll's estate, particularly the disposition of his 80 acres of land.
In May of the following year, in 1849, the Illinois Circuit Court ruled that John Driscoll's land should be divided equally among his legal heirs. Commissioners were appointed by the court to survey the property and make 10 equal parts for his 9 living children and 1 for the heirs of his deceased son, William. The commissioners visited the Driscoll property by September of that year, noting that it was 80 acres of excellent timbered land, and valuing the property at $10 per acre, about $1,300 per acre today.
John Driscoll's 80-acre farm was decomposed into 10 equal parts, north to south, each strip being 264 feet wide by 1,320 feet long, each comprising 8 acres. Lot 1, the northernmost strip, was allotted to Taylor Driscoll. Lot 2 to the heirs of William Driscoll, the heirs being his wife Margaret and 5 children. Lot 3 was allotted to David Driscoll. Lot 4 to Pierce. Lot 5 was given to daughter Betsy and her husband Lewis Wilson. Lot 6 to Sarah and her husband Reason Brody. Lot 7 was allotted to Delilah and her husband William Randall. Lot 8 went to Jane. Lot 9 was accorded to Emmeline and her husband Alva Woodward. And Lot 10, the southernmost strip, was granted to John Driscoll Jr.
Although these strips of land had timber value, they were too small to farm, and so the next few years saw the sell-off of lots by a few of the heirs, as some of the Driscoll children simply wanted to dispose of their lots for cash value. Taylor Driscoll and John Driscoll Jr. did most of the wheeling and dealing, acquiring lots from siblings, then transacting them to others. Down through the ensuing decades, the Driscoll lots came to be owned primarily by the Hildebrand and Sheaf families. And in the mid-1920s, Mary F. Sheaf, the widow of David Sheaf, sold a portion of the Driscoll property to a young farmer named Dewey Butler. Most of Butler's farm was adjacent to and south of the former Driscoll property, but this purchase included 9 acres of the southeast corner of Driscoll's land, importantly where it met a tributary of Killbuck Creek.
Dewey Hobson Butler was a local Monroe Township boy, a farmer, born in 1898 to Charlie Butler and Lulu Onstadt. He had a farmer's frame, medium height with a wiry, stocky build, a friendly smile set beneath black hair and brown eyes. Dewey never married. He was a quiet man who generally kept to himself. Some said he was a hermit. In time, another household, Roy and Donna Knoll, bought property adjoining Dewey's farm, fast becoming friends with the reclusive Butler. And over the years, the Knolls became the family that Dewey never had. As he had no heirs to pass along his estate, Dewey deeded his farm to the Knolls before he passed away in 1989, at the age of 91. More than 2 decades later, in 2015, the Knolls offered the north portion of the Butler property to Tom Lichty, whose property adjoined theirs. Knowing the history of the area and its connection to the Driscolls, Tom jumped at the opportunity.
Tom had been researching the Driscoll family for some time prior to this property purchase, as he had grown increasingly interested in the region's history, having grown up and spent his whole life in the area. When the purchase included the lengthy deed history and documents, Tom could not have been happier, as it provided remarkable details about the breakup and distribution of the John Driscoll property following his death in 1841.
To find out more, Tom sifted through Ogle County History Society newsletters, especially the writings of Armour Van Briesen, a noted local historian who penned many articles on the area between the 1950s and 1980s. It was through Van Briesen's writings that Tom Lichty learned of some obtuse details of the Driscolls' homestead and their burial ground, which hinted at their location. Armed with this new information, Tom wondered whether the location of the Driscoll Cabin, as well as the final resting place of the Driscolls, could be sorted.
Viewers may recall from our previous Bandits and Vigilantes series that various sources indicated that after the brutal execution and death of John Driscoll and his son William, their bodies were quickly buried in a shallow grave nearby the place of execution at Stevenson's Mill in Pine Rock Township, Ogle County. Later sources indicated that a few weeks after the lynching, friends of the Driscoll family quietly disinterred both John and William Driscoll for a more proper burial. This act of kindness was credited to a Driscoll neighbor named Watson, possibly Robert F. Watson, who also built them coffins, while another neighbor, Henry E. Hill, was credited with digging and watching over the gravesite.
However, there is some disagreement in the later sources as to the burial of William Driscoll. Some accounts state that both John and William were buried on the John Driscoll farm, while other accounts indicate that their burials were separate, with William removed to his farm in South Grove, DeKalb County, and John buried on his farm at Driscoll's Grove, Monroe Township, Ogle County. For our own part, we would tend to support the latter story, as William Driscoll's family, his wife Margaret and several children, who continued to live on their farm in South Grove for many years thereafter, would almost certainly have desired William's final resting place to be on their family farm, close by them, with the certitude that it would be maintained for years to come. However, for John Driscoll's grave, the sources all aligned that he was buried on his farm in Monroe Township, Ogle County, Illinois, and close by Killbuck Creek.
And this is where Tom Lichty's new research sheds light. By studying Armour Van Briesen's writings, as well as the topography of the former Driscoll farm, Tom began to formulate a hypothesis as to the location of the Driscoll homestead, as well as the disposition of the Driscoll gravesite. Regarding the Driscoll Cabin, Van Briesen stated that their buildings were also burned by the angry mob, but the stone chimney stood as a ghostly reminder for over 80 years, until the land was sold to its present owner in the 1920s.
The present owner referred to by Van Briesen was Dewey Butler. It was also Butler who would have cleared away the stone chimney and the remaining surrounding forest so that he could farm it. And if it had been cleared away, then it would have been located in what is today a tillable field, formerly owned by Dewey Butler, and even earlier part of the south section of the John Driscoll farm. Based on an 1864 survey map, Tom believes that the Driscoll cabin was located on his property about 100 to 200 feet from the present-day west timberline. Although it would have been a decidedly small log building, likely leaving little or no trace, Tom would nonetheless love to do some archaeology in the area, perhaps partnering with a local college or university in search of datable artifacts such as coins.
The 1839 original survey map of Monroe Township, Ogle County, also provides some intriguing clues, especially as it was recorded at the very time of Driscoll's residence. The John Driscoll property, outlined in yellow, consisted of 80 acres. The map shows that most of his property was set within timberland, east of the Killbuck, with the exception of a small plowed field, triangular in shape, consisting of about 5 acres, angled to the east. With a handful of livestock, a few acres for vegetables, and 2 or 3 acres for wheat and oats, this acreage may have been sufficient for John Driscoll to feed his family, but little else.
Some have suggested that the timber forest was ideal for a hideout for criminal activity, although the tilled field would have been a dead giveaway for his presence, and his neighbors certainly knew where he lived. Given the proximity of a sawmill just a short distance downstream on the Killbuck, it is much more likely that Driscoll earned some income managing and logging his forest. In fact, for many early settlers and colonists on the Illinois prairie, timberland was the first and most reliable source of cash income, as wood was in constant demand for cabins, farm structures, fences, and fuel.
Regarding the Driscoll gravesite, Tom noticed multiple clues in Van Briesen's writings. First, Van Briesen indicated that the burial location was in a secluded spot, far into the woods. He also described Dewey Butler discovering the gravesite eroding out of the ground as a result of flooding from the nearby Killbuck. This would have been sometime after his purchase of the property in the mid to late 1920s. So as to take the gravesite out of harm's way, Dewey Butler moved what remained of the graves, now more than 80 years in the earth, to higher ground. But where was this original gravesite? And where was the higher ground to which Van Briesen alluded?
Tom Lichty knew that the Killbuck Creek did not pass through the Driscoll property, either in the earlier days or the present, instead being about 1,000 feet to the west of the property. However, a small tributary of the Killbuck did drain along the southeast portion of the Driscoll property, the small tract of land owned by Dewey Butler, and then subsequently by Tom Lichty. He reasoned that if the Driscoll grave was on John Driscoll property and close to the Killbuck, then it could be in only one location, along the southeast corner where the tributary just touches the southern edge of the Driscoll property, for a distance of about 20 rods.
According to the 1839 survey map for Monroe Township, in John Driscoll's day, this tributary was something of a slough, likely seasonal in its drainage to the Killbuck. Tom has investigated the banks of this creek in search of evidence for a mid-19th century burial, as yet without success. But he has found evidence of prehistoric materials, arrowheads, as well as an antler of the eastern elk that Tom had carbon dated to the mid-1500s. However, as the remains were later moved, this lack of evidence is not surprising. And according to the available sources, this location is the only place on the original Driscoll property that corresponds to the oral tradition regarding the Driscoll burials.
But where was the higher ground referred to by Van Briesen, the location of the Driscoll reburial? Tom Lichty reasoned that Dewey Butler would very likely have put the graves somewhere along a field boundary, in a place that would be out of the way of his seasonal plowing. Tom noted that the field boundary that once separated the Driscoll property heading north ran close to the original location of the graves along the Killbuck. Interestingly, he also observed that a single pair of oak trees stood about 300 feet north of the tributary along this line. The trees were curious as they were somewhat out of place within the field previously cleared by Dewey Butler. They were so curious that Tom suspects that they were planted there intentionally and for a very specific reason. Did Dewey Butler plant these trees as a marker for the reinterred Driscoll remains? Although Dewey told the Knolls of his movement of the Driscoll Graves site, he unfortunately never specified its new location to them.
Based on significant circumstantial evidence, however, Tom Lichty believes that there is a high likelihood that John Driscoll and perhaps his son William are buried beneath or nearby the lone oak trees in the middle of the field that once marked the east edge of John Driscoll's property and his infamous timber grove, facing east towards the morning sun. It appears to tick all of the boxes, as they say. It is on higher ground, close by the Killbuck tributary, a short distance from the former Driscoll Cabin, out of harm's way of the plow, situated on Dewey Butler's former property, as well as the former property of the Driscoll family. His belief is such that earlier this year, Tom commissioned an engraved boulder to be fashioned to serve as a grave marker for the site.
The monument was delivered and placed in late August of 2025, more than 184 years since the Driscoll's execution. Located beneath the quiet shade of protective oaks, while great stands of corn in silent, vigilant rows stood watch.
Son William lived just south.
The message conveyed on this monument can be seen as an epistle to both the Driscoll adherents as well as their executioners.
But is there anything more to say of the Campbell-Driscoll tragedy? Has it been wrung dry of all of its meaning and interpretation? Something that we did not discuss in our first series, as we endeavored to stay focused on hard and concrete evidence, but which emerged in our original research, was an insight while visiting the graves of the Driscoll descendants in Forest Hill Cemetery in Glen Ellen, DuPage County, Illinois. Here were graves of the Pierce Driscoll line, the Driscoll son who was spared execution from the vigilante mob, as well as their close relations, the Brodys.
Seeing the graves of these intermarried and extended families, the Driscolls and Brodys, huddled closely beneath the trees in the corner of the cemetery, made us realize that Brodie was an anglicized version of Brady, a distinctly Irish surname, as was, of course, the surname Driscoll, and even the surname Aiken, of Scotch-Irish origin, the maiden name of John Driscoll's wife, Mercy. And that insight opened up a different perspective regarding the conflicts, crimes, and murders that took place on the northern Illinois plains in the early 1840s.
Nativism, as it was called in the 19th century, was an American form of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic bigotry, inherited from elder cousin England, and was especially virulent in the New England states, where Anglo-Saxon ancestry was most prevalent. Roman Catholic Irish were viewed as being violent, alcoholic, prone to crime and vice, and carriers of disease. In popular literature, the Irish were often portrayed as having bestial, ape-like, or demonic features. One can only be reminded of the description of John Driscoll in the 1878 History of Ogle County. His face was the only repulsive feature about old John Driscoll, and this repulsiveness was occasioned by the loss of a part of his nose, which had been bitten off some years before in a fight with some human ghoul. His hair was iron gray and coarse, his eyebrows heavy and shaggy-like.
Consider the perspective where wagon loads of New England expatriates wind their way into the Rock River Valley for new opportunities in the late 1830s, only to learn that a cluster of Irish families had taken root in some of the more fertile prairies and prominent groves of the region. It would be too much to suggest that the new arrivals had cast aside their negative Irish inclinations when they crossed beyond the borders of their native states of New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, especially as anti-Irish nativism reached its peak from the 1830s to the 1850s, the very time when this story unfolded.
The story, as reported by contemporaries and even today, is framed as good versus evil, as righteous vigilantes against desperate bandit gangs, as good citizens against crime-ridden families. However, as we reported in our earlier video series, there was scant evidence presented against John Driscoll and William Driscoll in their mock trial in 1841, but only the general feeling that the Driscoll family was somehow and in some way at the head of a vast regional criminal enterprise, an accusation that did not appear to bear out when regional crime continued unabated years after the execution of the Driscolls. Nor did probate records, with their detailed inventories, suggest that William Driscoll, at least, was anything but a farmer, living in a very modest household. If the Driscolls were criminal masterminds, as reported, they apparently did not profit from it. What is more, the Driscolls' immediate neighbors, in both Ogle and DeKalb counties, generally viewed them in a positive light.
This is not to suggest that the Driscolls and Brodys were not without blemish, or to say that at least a few of the Driscoll family were not involved in some crimes, or even in the murder of John Campbell. Rather, this is to suggest that a significant core of the anti-Driscoll attitudes within the Rock River Valley was based in anti-Irish nativism. The raw and visceral violence that exploded in the Driscoll executions, as well as the vengeful destruction of their homestead and properties, had little to do with justice, and much more with the wiping away of these families from the community.
If one reads anew the chain of events that transpired in the spring and summer of 1841, but instead from the Driscolls' point of view, then they may not appear as the notorious crime family as depicted in lore and legend, but rather as something of a backwoods, isolated, extended family who largely kept to themselves, knowing that they would not be accepted in the many Anglo-Saxon communities springing up in Oregon and other small towns across the region. Indeed, if you read through the roster of 100 or so names who participated in the Driscoll's executions, members all of the Regulators, those who were later indicted and acquitted in the Driscoll murders, they are almost all Anglo-Saxon surnames, peppered with a handful of Scottish names, including John Campbell. This is not simply an unhappy coincidence.
We, of course, do not like to hear of such things in our collective story, as it creates discomfort. The original tale, largely constructed 3 or 4 decades after the events, peppered with details and anecdotes that are highly improbable, but which paints a story of black and white virtues, is simpler to understand, and aligns more with our moral compass. However, harsh reality often conflicts with our nostalgic understanding of our ancestors. People good and true, hardworking, earnest, law-abiding citizens, just trying to get along. And indeed this was often true, but not always.
Meanwhile, what remains of John Driscoll, at least, likely abides beneath the shade of oak trees, in a field that he once plowed, nearby a creek that he likely named, and today, thanks to Tom Lichty, memorialized with a great stone, a rock of remembrance, and an epitaph for eternity.
A huge shout out and thanks to Tom Lichty, landowner and historian extraordinaire, and to his fellow Ogle County historians Michael Burnett and Otto Dick. As always, too, many thanks to our Be Historic channel community, our subscribers, our Super Thanks contributors, and our generous Patreon supporters and other benefactors. If you're enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, share, and hype via the hype button. And if you're so inclined, consider supporting our channel via Patreon. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.